Hello, I am Tina, Tank's full-time voiceover artist. In this episode of the Tank Magazine podcast, Thomas Roueché speaks to the writer and cultural theorist Joe Kennedy. Kennedy teaches English and Cultural Studies on the University of Gothenburg program at the University of Sussex. His first book, Games Without Frontiers, was published in 2016. His second, Authentocrats, Culture, Politics and the New Seriousness, was published last June by Repeater Books and examines what he calls the populism of the centre. Here, Kennedy discusses the generational divide in British politics, reactionary Englishness and the fetishisation of authenticity in our post-liberal age.
I thought of your book, obviously, instantly yesterday when John McDonnell was asked to choose his favourite biscuit.
I didn't know that had happened.
Yeah, Mumsnet asks people to choose their favourite biscuit.
Yeah.
And he chose a rich tea biscuit. And I thought it was, I think the whole thing is kind of a perfect example of, I think, a lot of the different ideas that you grapple with in the book. But yeah, I think, maybe if you wanted to start off with talking about the ideas of what you mean by authentocracy, and then we can go from there.
I have to apologise because I give a different answer every time somebody asks me this. So every interview I've done, you get a slightly different answer. But what I was trying to grapple with when I started writing the book was a number of politicians who mostly came out of a kind of Labour moderate position, and who you could affiliate to Blairism or to Brownism or to some kind of continuity New Labour idea, who, having been enthusiastic advocates of kind of the notion that we're all middle class now for much of the 1990s and the 2000s, kind of celebrating the virtues of being the kind of new bourgeois, if you like, has suddenly kind of reverted or defaulted or shifted to this attempt to come across as very, very salty and kind of down with the real people, and often talking up the kind of importance of this kind of so-called white working class who'd been left behind and so on, so who had kind of wanted to advertise their own proliness, if you like, if we can kind of coin that term there. And you suddenly found a lot of politicians, particularly those who are opposed to Jeremy Corbyn, started to come out and say things like, Jeremy Corbyn and those around him don't know anything about the real working classes of Britain, and kind of talking up their kind of football supporting and their biscuit consumption and their kind of stylised mediocrity or something like that they wanted to say, look, I'm not a pretentious hipster lefty, I can understand the real people, and the real people were always positioned as being not in London, not metropolitan, always white, generally speaking provincial, kind of far away from London, and in these towns that Labour was supposedly losing, which could be any number of a British provincial town, like the one that I come from, to be honest. This was the kind of starting point of annoyance, but what I also ended up doing was thinking, well, it's actually only this kind of political attempt to play up one's, or kind of downplay one's origins, very often became linked to what I saw as a kind of post-liberal turn in culture, which is this move away from the kind of third-way liberalism of the 90s towards writers about politics who start to advocate a kind of a slightly sanitised version of some extremely right-wing positions, a kind of new nationalism. Writers like David Goodhart, Mark Liller in the States, and then you kind of see other kind of post-liberal figures include the kind of clownish Jordan Peterson and the kind of more openly right-wing Douglas Murray, these people who are saying, well, liberalism is done, we need to start looking to the past for political solutions, and it's quite revanchist. It tends towards the model of the kind of nation state as an ideal, or kind of ethno-state as an ideal for how politics should be organised. So that was some of what was going on, this kind of weird shift that people on the right wing of the Labour Party were starting to kind of make towards those positions. And along with this, and what was more interesting to me, because really kind of literature and cultural studies is my kind of main area of interest. I'm not interested in kind of party politics, to be honest. It's what was happening in Labour at the time seems to be a kind of symptom of kind of deeper cultural malaise. And what I was interested in are all these kind of conservative movements within British culture more generally. This very kind of banal type of nature writing. So you go into Waterstones. We could go into Waterstones around the corner right now, and we find a whole section of books called things like Fox and Field and so on. And in a slightly kind of broad brush way, I love nature. I spend a lot of time walking in the country, but I also think there's something really suspicious. There's these kind of books, these texts are always linked to a particular idea of Englishness. Also the celebration of World War II, and of course this kind of fixation on World War II and the interwar period as well, which goes from kind of literary culture. There's so many books at the moment, and for the last 10 years, which are set in an era when people allegedly knew their place, going right through to kind of what's on the TV. You see programs like the Great British Menu where they're cooking tributes to D-Day, this sort of thing. It can be quite amazing. It's quite surreal. But those were the things I was kind of playing around with in the book.
And I mean, I was interested because obviously Raymond Williams is a really important touchstone, I think, in terms of the way in which you look at some of those kind of how culture is operating in those spaces. I mean, would you be able to say a little bit about his work in relation to that?
The essay that I was really riffing off was Culture is Ordinary, which is a short essay, and it's kind of, as you probably know, it's rather biographical, and actually, by Williams's standards, it's really quite lyrical as well. I mean, for all of Williams's brilliance as a thinker, I think, and I was discussing this with a mate the other day, Williams is a very stodgy writer, I think, particularly in Culture and Society and The Long Revolution, these books which are so important in terms of their ideas, but are really hard to read because he's a very flat, kind of Leavisite writer of prose, I think. And Williams, in Culture is Ordinary, he kind of connects with his childhood, I think, in a way that he also tries to do in his novels. And he talks about, as a kid, he takes this journey to Hereford to go and look at the Mappa Mundi, which is in the cathedral there. And he uses this as a kind of a symbol of what people mean when they say culture, a kind of Matthew Arnold style vision of culture, all of what is great and good bequeathed to us by history. And he travels back on the bus from Hereford to his home village in South Wales, and he can see the blast furnaces in the distance. And he says, but this is also culture. There is not such thing as cultured and uncultured. Like, culture is ordinary, culture is everywhere. Culture is the kind of production of meaning in human societies. And what Williams is getting at there, I think, is this beautiful passage on who he calls cheapjacks, kind of marketing men who try and play with this idea of unculturedness. He's saying, no, you can't say that to be real is to be uncultured, because everyone, whatever a class origin, is participating in culture on some level. And what I saw was going on with a number of these kind of so-called moderate Labour politicians was that they were trying to present themselves in a really cynical way as uncultured. Along with a load of kind of compliant media commentators. So things like when Jeremy Corbyn gets up on, and I have to make a caveat here that I'm not an enthusiastic fan of Jeremy Corbyn the person. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm just saying that he's brought out some terrible tendencies in people. Corbyn says his favourite book is Ulysses, and a load of people say, well, how can he be in touch with the common man if his favourite book is Ulysses? And you're like, do you know which fucking people have celebrated the book Ulysses and its history? Do you know what a touchstone it was for working class literature in Scotland and Ireland and actually much of kind of provincial Britain throughout the 20th century? This idea that kind of to display any kind of cultural interest is somehow marking you out as aloof, that suddenly comes into play over the last few years. So Williams is important there, and I think the other thing with Williams is relentlessly historicist, obviously. Williams always wants to say that was culture then, but that doesn't mean that it is a solid basis for saying what culture is now. Culture is dynamic, it's dialectical, it's always moving on to some kind of new stage. The other thing about Williams is he is unfalteringly precise in his descriptions of particular places. Now, what I was interested in doing in parts of the book was to talk about this kind of geographical turn in British journalistic culture, where in order to tell political truth about Britain. You send someone to Barrow-in-Furness, then you send them to Seaham, then you send them to Dereham or wherever, and these places all turn into the same place in a kind of Guardian politics journalist's imagination. Williams would never have had that. Williams would always say, you need to know exactly why this place is like it is, what its kind of deep economic, social history is, what meanings are produced in that place now are a product of like a kind of long history of the production of meanings. So for me, those are the important things about Williams, his kind of insistence on culture, his insistence on historicisation, and his precision of kind of geographical reportage as well.
I was interested because also I think that there's something, and maybe it's a kind of maybe the wider influence of Williams, but you also have this interesting, you talk a lot about the sort of cultural moment of the 90s, but also particularly maybe let's say the late 90s. It's interesting for us because we were obviously founded in 1998 as part of a cultural moment in which people were, the sort of combination of high and low was this kind of, had a certain frisson that, you know what I mean, that people take for granted now. It's interesting, obviously, that many of the people who were so involved in kind of presenting, sort of high and low culture together, things like, let's say, the Modern Review or, other such publications are very much all people who've reverted to this kind of authentic, or many have reverted to this mode of kind of grasping for some sort of
Absolutely. This is what I think, and I'm really, really glad you asked that, because I feel like sometimes in discussions of this book that people have kind of honed in on the headline stuff, which is like Owen Smith says something funny about coffee, which is not what I was writing about really. What I was really interested in is that kind of way that irreverence shifted. There was a shift from irreverence to this kind of solid, we need to take everything seriously now. So as you say, there was a kind of smorgasbord approach to culture in the late 90s, I think, particularly in London, where everything was good. It's good to, it's a blur vision of culture, isn't it? It's good to get 10-ton lager all the time, but it's also good to go to the gallery. By sort of this decade, it's now not good to be eclectic. It's not good to be irreverent either. It's, what you're supposed to do is I suppose that it's the kind of elevation of sententiousness to a principle. So I'll use the word seriousness in the subtitle quite ironically. I think this we see it all over the place. This kind of shift towards seriousness, but it's not really serious. It's sententious, or I'm trying to find another synonym for that. But definitely, the people who were doing the 90s, if you like, I think Caitlin Moran, someone like that, is a good example. Doing the 90s, they are all kind of, they would identify as pop-timistic, like pop culture is great, pop culture is great because it allows you to be anything you want to be. We love David Bowie as a great influence on this period and his vaunted chameleonism. But by nowadays, it's all kind of going back to your origins and saying, in Moran style, I'm from a council estate in Wolverhampton and therefore I can say anything I want about anything. So people kind of dropping the optimism is part of it. Does that make sense?
I mean, I think it's also interesting because I guess I had also, I also read, after I read this, I read David Stubbs's book on 1906, which I thought was, just interesting as well because he kind of has a long discussion of the where he talks very closely about the Blair Revolution and that text and and it's just quite interesting to kind of really, it's kind of fine-grained kind of analysis of it because you really, I think it's a kind of somehow forgotten. But I think one of the things I thought was interesting is that the question of whether within this sort of, these authenticrat types, whether there's a sincere belief in their own opinions or the extent to which some of this is kind of performative, because I think, it was interesting to me that trajectory seems, it's one that you observe, but it also makes you wonder, what happened along the way, what is the kind of, is this really what you sort of believe?
Yeah, and I don't think I answered the question very well in the book. I did I think I've made a tradition now of asking questions in the opening chapters of books that then I may have forgotten about by the end. I mean, my last book was about football, and a friend said to me, like, I love the book, but you set up this argument at the beginning that then disappears. And I thought, well, that's a fair cop, to be honest. That is what's happened. In this book, I don't know, and it's bugged me ever since. I was discussing this on another podcast the other night with reference to the New Statesman, and the New Statesman now being this totally kind of enervated read of people just kind of hacking out the same attack lines which don't even make sense, and they feel as if their authors don't really believe what they're saying either. I mean, there's a kind of desperation to it, sort of playground politics. And I think that maybe it would be wise not to kind of have a hard division between what is believed and what's not believed, or what's, as the term you use, is performative. I think there is a strange middle ground where some of these people don't really know what they're doing themselves. Sometimes I feel like it's entirely cynical, it's all attack, disinformation, but I think that what we're looking at is what happens when a worldview fails, and what happens to the people who are invested in that worldview when it fails. It's Titanicism, isn't it? In a way, it's like this ship can't be sinking, even though my waist is deep in the water. It can't be because they said the ship couldn't sink, I think, and something like that has happened with the third way, both in Britain and America, and maybe further afield. This can't possibly have been wrong, because on some to New Labour is that it almost feels historically inevitable in 1997. There were kind of good reasons that people were struggling to kind of advance more radically left-wing solutions for things. But now it feels very much the opposite. It feels like it feels as redundant and aimless as the kind of major back to basics politics did in the mid-90s, just kind of like bumbling around, getting in the way of I suppose what really needs to be happening. It is disproportionately represented in the media in comparison to what people out in the world seem to think. I find it very bizarre. I find it particularly bizarre that there's an attempt very often by Blairites and kind of Blairite adjacents in the media to represent Corbynism and the left as a kind of online bubble. I mean, I think you could almost argue that it's the other way around.
100%. I mean, you also discussed this kind of, that within political centrism there is this kind of dialectic between the kind of, I think you've described it somewhere elsewhere as kind of ostentatious tolerance versus kind of a liberalism that's gone too far.
Yeah.
So can I get you just to speak a little bit more about that kind of 90s moment and that kind of, that idea of that dialectic?
I think that this is one of the shortcomings of the book, is that it tends to treat what was happening in politics in around 1996 and what was happening culturally in 1996 as absolutely analogous, and that isn't really true. I mean, Blairism wasn't quite as cuddlily liberal as I have maybe presented it, and I do think that was I feel a bit apologetic about that. But yeah, in the early 1990s, when I was starting secondary school, most television was that I seemed to watch, and this was probably because I spent a lot of time watching television on a Sunday night, wanting it to still be Sunday night and not be Monday morning, was like loads and loads of comedies, which, whether they were set in space like Red Dwarf, or whether they were set on a kind of Barrett Holmes estate in Northampton, like I think arguably Keeping Up Appearances is, they had real weird structural similarities in the I'm not going to say villain, because it's not usually a villain, it's more the kind of object of ridicule is somebody who is a kind of uptight post-war Tory, a very kind of Conservative Party grassroots Tory, and that could be Hyacinth in Keeping Up Appearances, or it could be Arnold Rimmer in Red Dwarf. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's just the same figure over and over again, and they are kind of ripped to pieces all the time for their pretensions and their inability to engage with the new world as it is. The square, the Tory square, is the kind of it's such an easy go-to in early 90s culture. It's even on kids' TV. I was talking about it in the book, in the computer games television, like this idea that there were kind of uptight people who wouldn't understand video games and so on. It was there in a crystal maze as well. But those people have now become the people who culture is telling us that we need to pay more attention to. So there's this, we're sorry we offended her, said the bouquet. She is the real disenfranchised voice of Britain, with her small c conservatism and her alarm clock husband. And yeah, well, this is really odd because it feels like it's the same people doing it. And then it's in that kind of oscillation between a kind of ostentatious liberalism and equally almost ostentatious illiberalism that you find the kind of centrist position. This is because I suppose a kind of very Marxist way of thinking about it would be to think of liberalism as only a kind of superstructural expression of capitalism. And Marcuse wrote an essay on this in the late 60s where he's saying that capitalism can kind of bend liberalism into any shape it wants. I don't know, I totally agree with that, by the way. So I really try to avoid where I can, like using liberal as a pejorative, because I think you get into dangerous territory when you're doing that. But in times of boom, it's very easy to kind of mock the socially illiberal, and then in times of in not so good times, capitalism tends to want to point the finger and say this is not the fault of the economic structure, it's the fault of a problem in that structure, and that's usually some kind of outside group. And then it makes these populist appeals to what positions as majority groups. So I think something like that is going on. What we're talking about really is an attempt to kind of maintain a free market consensus, a kind of neoliberal consensus, which confusingly can create this compact between that ostentatious tolerance and an ostentatious intolerance.
Yeah, I mean, I guess also just wanted to, the one other sort of floating question that I think he interviewed in the latest issue, Malcolm Harris, about his book, Kids These Days. And one of the questions we asked was about Gen X, and he was like, it's a smaller, the Authenticrats is the way in which you talk about the sort of the generational moment of Gen X. And I think you see it throughout lots of the elements of things that we've spoken about already. But I think also there's the sort of like the twee moment as well in that kind of in the early noughties. I don't know. It's just interesting how the kind of that culture of the people who lived the boom so fully, if you know what I mean, plays out. And I think I think it plays out at the moment. I think there's so many ways in which the kind of current arguments around, let's say within the Guardian opinion pages, shall we say, seems to be very much between centrists and Corbynites, in a very broad sense, seems to be very generational.
Yeah, a year or so older than me, and you start knowing what kind of cultural preferences and political preferences a lot of people have. And I wish that instead of centrist dads, we'd use the term Peloton liberals, because there is this. It's always the people who are obsessed with the Tour de France. I'm not saying that bikes are good. Amsterdam-style bike city would be brilliant, but I'd rather be able to walk around London or Brighton without being cut down by someone dressed as Alberto Contador. Yeah, that and this kind of very assured attitude that Corbynism must be wrong, and the EU is the big problem, Jeremy. And what are you going to do about the EU, Jeremy? Sorry. Or how are you going to stop us leaving the EU, Jeremy? And they all seem to be eating the same stuff and dress in the same ways and have the same kind of antipathy towards what they see as hipsters. And there is a generational conflict, as you say, going on between Gen X. It's hard to say, are they really Gen X? Does that phrase work so well in a British context? But who are coterminous with Gen X in America and millennials, and then there are people who are in the middle who don't really fit either category, like me, who are probably that lump of people are being pulled in different directions, probably according to their kind of material interests. I'd venture, as someone who 37 doesn't own a house, my sympathies with the millennials. I think it is something that I kind of want to put into better words, or even write about again in some place, but I don't quite know exactly how you would frame it, because some of these things often feel quite intangible, don't they? Like that guy likes an American kind of old country from 2001. Why does that necessarily mean that they backed Owen Smith in the Labour leadership contest? I mean, it doesn't, but
it also does.
It also does. Yeah. Why did that come about? I think the whole thing, that term centrist dads, I think that was all very misunderstood, including by a lot of the people who were using it pejoratively. I think that Corbynites really misidentified who the enemy was, and they often kind of created this cartoon idea of a 50-something man in a leather jacket having a bit of a midlife crisis over Corbyn, and that wasn't who it was at all. It was the people who were 43 and still got a festival and who've never stopped. It's not people having a midlife crisis, it's people whose crisis is that everything will always have to be the 90s and it will never stop being the late 90s.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because I also think there's a kind of preoccupation with, there's an easy way to kind of kick things up to the boomers and be like, do you know what I mean? Like, well, they had it the best, so I don't know, as a way of kind of like, I don't know, it's an interesting sort of generational moment.
I mean, a lot of the most people politically in play at the moment aren't boomers, are they? I mean, who's responsible for Brexit amongst the Tories? David Cameron, Boris Johnson? None of them are, strictly speaking, boomers, and probably if you map them out, they would be as close to Gen X as they were to boomers.
Was like that thing about Nigel Farage being the same age as Brad Pitt?
Yeah.
Which is just like endlessly mind-blowing. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we tend to think, this is all people who were born in sort of 1947, 1948. It wasn't often these people were born in the early 1960s, 6 or 7 years before the Gen Xers, really. So there's a lot of misidentification happening. The material interests of the boomers are important here. And the fact that they're the ones who tend to keep on voting for the Conservatives and for Brexit, but I don't think that they're necessarily the ones who have the kind of loudest cultural voice. So there is some intriguing slippages. All of that, so much of this comes down to the fact that, like, British culture generally is underanalysed, misunderstood, and treated in very broad brush terms in order to get cheap laughs on Mock the Week or something like that. We could have a better public sphere which looks at things that are currently happening in a more detailed and molecular way, and we don't. And there's a sort of endless frustration to me. The right talk often about political correctness, but I think there is a kind of political correctness of thoughts, or a kind of sorts, or a limiting of debate, but it's not the one that the right say it is. It's there are things that are just beyond kind of discussion, which are just treated as empirical facts that we shouldn't be querying. Like there's no attempt really even really in the Guardian, the Statesman, to have a conversation about the way that World War II and World War I are fetishised and represented, and you might get broadly welcome, but I think still very superficial things about, what about the Indian soldiers who fought in World War I or something like that, and maybe we should be having that discussion, but maybe we should also be having the kind of meta discussion about why are we so fixated on these things, what purposes are these historical moments serving in the present. But editors, producers, they seem to shy away from it. I think that there is and not to fetishise the recent past too much, because I'm a bit wary of this celebration of kind of British social democratic culture in the 60s and 70s, but I don't think you would have got away with the kind of easy answers you get now in the 1970s. I think we had a more interrogative public sphere then, and the 80s even.
No, definitely. It's I think it's so interesting. Like, it's like the figure of I went down this kind of rabbit hole the other day of the thing of Harry Leslie Smith, that there's that kind of conspiracy theory. Yeah, exactly. Because it's like, it's just impossible that someone who is like part of the glorious generation could have those political opinions. It doesn't compute. So therefore, it's a fascinating kind of.
It's amazing, isn't it? That the depths of obsession amongst some of these people. Harry Leslie Smith is a psyop connived by Seamus Milne. And Vladimir Putin, it is properly bizarre. It overlooks so much. I think one of the problems is, though, that you're getting and I do this myself, on the left we go, well, people don't talk about the fact that there was kind of like significant Communist Party membership then and the Battle of Cable Street, and we kind of ignore these things at the expense of the nationalistic narrative. And I go, well, yes, but maybe also the problem is that we keep on reverting the discussion to things that happened in the 1930s and the 1940s more generally. It is weird that we look to someone like Harry Leslie Smith to authenticate our own narratives about the present. In a way, that is still a kind of authentocracy, I think, that we're always kind of anxiously looking to what is increasingly the distant past to tell our own stories.
Yeah, and I think also very much in the lead up to the referendum, I felt there was a lot of kind of people saying, well, actually, the generation who fought through the war were hugely pro-EU, so therefore you should, do you know what I mean? I mean, which is a kind of, again, like fascinating way of thinking about, I don't know, trying to sway people's opinions.
Some of this does come down to boomers, I think. There's this kind of guilty deference to their parents' generation, but partly because being a boomer sort of involved, like, pissing off and ignoring what your parents told you to do in a way. 1960s, you could conceive as this huge, albeit temporary, rebellion against the wartime generation, and then you see the boomers kind of getting to pensionable age and starting to think, well, I wish I hadn't been such a snotty little git, really, and now I'm going to defer to whatever they might have thought. So you're right. You saw this idea that we shouldn't leave the EU because Brexit, because the EU or EU membership is patriotic, and that's what we fought the Nazis for, and so on. There is a real difficulty, I think, that people still have in kind of laying claim to the present, and that was one of the things that kind of got me thinking about the book in the first place. Why do people find it more easy to say that my grandparents worked in a steel mill in Middlesbrough than they do to say I pay 75% of my income in rent and live in a box in order to have a not very well paying, or contextually not very well paying job, which is going to make it incredibly difficult for me to have a family, and some things that happen in the present end up feeling, and they've always been kind of compared by analogy to the past, don't they? We look at the Syrian war, for example, the issue of migration, this kind of huge population movements. They need to be understood as their own thing rather than treated in an analogous way. These things are kind of building the future, to think in a way which kind of respects their uniqueness and their singularity.
More podcasts from Tank Magazine. Subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud and an Electronic Orchestra.